As fierce fighting in and around Bakhmut is raging on, the Ukrainian military said it was conducting counterattacks in the devastated salt mining town of Soledar. Earlier in the day, President Volodymyr Zelensky pledged that the units defending Bakhmut and Soledar would be provided with ammunition and everything necessary, promptly and uninterruptedly. He added that Ukraine's armed forces are reinforced with equipment and weapons supplied by the West. Kyiv states that the battle for Soledar between Ukrainian forces and the Russian army and the Kremlin-controlled Wagner group is underway, despite some claims that Moscow controls the town. Soledar is located 10 kilometers north of Bakhmut, a city Russia has tried to seize for over 5 months. The General Staff Deputy Chief Alexei Hromov said on January 12 that the military expects Russian forces to attempt to capture all of Donetsk Oblast in the near future. Ukraine's Special Operations Forces reported that more than 100 Russian soldiers were killed in the Battle of Soledar after Ukrainian forces launched a missile attack. A group of Russian soldiers was identified by Ukraine's Special Operations Forces, according to the Special Ops Command. Artillery was directed at the concentration of troops, followed by a Tochka-U missile, killing the Russian soldiers in the area, the command said. Along with 100 troops, the strike destroyed Russian military equipment. At the same time, the Ukrainian military spokesperson Serhiy Cherevatiy reported that Soledar came under Russian attacks 91 times over the past day. As Moscow troops struggle to capture Soledar, the Kremlin is accumulating its forces in Ukraine. According to Malier, the mobilized conscripts from the training grounds in Russia and Belarus are deployed to the combat zones and border areas. As of January 10, about 280 formations operate as part of the Russian forces, taking into account the operational reserve, compared to 250 formations last week. Suffering heavy losses, Russia is planning a new wave of mobilization for the war against Ukraine, Andriy Chernyak, a spokesman for Ukraine's military intelligence, said on January 7. As many as 500,000 conscripts could be called up, in addition to 300,000 that were already drafted, Chernyak reported. Vadim Skibitsky, Ukraine's deputy military intelligence chief, earlier said the conscripts would likely be sent to the front lines in the east and south of Ukraine and would be part of renewed Russian offensives in the spring and summer. According to the General Staff, as of January 12, Russia has lost 112,960 troops in Ukraine since February 24. The death toll of Russian troops is the highest the country has suffered since the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan or arguably since World War II, Zelensky earlier said. The battle for conflict-battered Soledar in eastern Ukraine is one of the most ferocious of Russia's nearly year-long campaign, with Moscow desperate for a win and Kyiv determined to hold ground. Here's what you need to know about Soledar and why the battle for this small industrial city matters. Soledar is a small salt mining town in Ukraine's largely Russian-occupied industrial Donetsk region. It had a pre-fighting population of only around 11,000 people. Before it became the epicenter of fighting, it was known for being the largest salt mine in Europe, and its 120 miles of underground tunnel now lend a tactical advantage. Crucially, it is only about 9 miles from the city of Bakhmut, a key prize for Russian troops. Seizing the city and neighboring Soledar would be vital to Moscow's main goal of wresting control over all of Donetsk. But observers of the conflict were divided over the strategic importance of Soledar. One analyst, who spoke on the condition of anonymity, said that for Russia gaining Soledar would be a victory with little strategic value. For Ukraine, on the other hand, presidential advisor Mykola Podolyak told AFP this week that Bakhmut, and with it Soledar, could be a launching pad to retake the larger city of Donetsk, which has been a Russian stronghold since 2014. The fight also matters because the two sides have now invested heavily in it. Russia and Ukraine have said the fighting is fierce and conceded heavy losses. Nowhere is the growing role of Russian mercenaries in the Ukraine conflict more apparent than in Bakhmut and Soledar. The battle for Soledar has also exposed growing rifts between Moscow's forces in Ukraine, made up of the Russian army, Wagner mercenaries, and East Ukrainian separatist forces. Confusion reigned after Wagner announced this week its forces captured Soledar. But the Kremlin told reporters to hold 4 official announcements, and the defense ministry countered the claim, saying fighting was ongoing. Ukraine sent more than 100 Russian soldiers to hell in a coordinated strike on the front lines in the battle for the control of Soledar, its military has claimed. In a statement, the military said the soldiers went together to hell after they were struck by missiles. Soledar has been the center of Russian aggression in recent days as it lies north of the strategically important city of Bakhmut. Yevgeny Prigozhin, head of the Wagner mercenary group and a close ally of Russian President Vladimir Putin, said his forces had captured all of Soledar and killed about 500 Ukrainian soldiers after heavy fighting. The brutality of the fighting in the area has been widely commented on by the Ukrainians. Ukraine's deputy defense minister, Hanna Maliar, said earlier this week Russia has thrown a large number of storm groups into the fight for the city. Donetsk Governor Pavlo Kirilenko told Ukrainian state TV that 559 civilians remain in Soledar, including 15 children, and it was impossible to evacuate them due to ongoing fighting. The town had a pre-war population of around 10,500. Russia has struggled to cement control over the town, which would be Russia's most substantial gain since August after a series of retreats before Ukrainian counteroffensives in the east and south. Earlier this week Russia appointed Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov as overall commander for what Moscow calls its special military operation in Ukraine, now in its 11th month. The change effectively demoted General Sergei Surovikin, who was appointed only in October to lead the invasion and oversaw heavy attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. If pro-Russian forces succeed in taking Soledar, it would be a stepping stone in Moscow's thrust to capture Ukraine's eastern Donbas industrial region. The town would be a base to attack the nearby city of Bakhmut, a supply line hub in eastern Ukraine, where defenders have held out for months. Ukrainian defense officials are zeroing in on tank deliveries from the US and European partners, saying the firepower and security provided by the armored artillery vehicles will keep up the momentum in its efforts to rout invading Russian forces. The Biden administration has increased the heavy artillery it is providing Ukraine, but has done so slowly and incrementally to protect against perceptions that Washington is provoking Russian President Vladimir Putin. Ukrainian officials have welcomed the Biden administration's recent announcement to supply armored vehicles with machine guns, Bradley fighting vehicles, but are pushing for Washington to commit to sending Abrams tanks. Valery Zaluzhnyi, commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces, told The Economist last month that Kyiv needs 300 tanks to achieve a decisive victory on the battlefield against Russia, along with 700 infantry fighting vehicles and 500 howitzers. Abrams tanks are preferable to lighter vehicles due to strong armor, maneuverability, precise shooting system and a shock effect, said Jeffrey Edmonds, senior adjunct fellow with the Center for New American Security and a lieutenant colonel in the Army Reserves who has operated Abrams tanks. SAC said that 200 tanks to Ukraine could make a difference, and credits Western tanks as being safer than Russian or Soviet-era armored fighting vehicles. The U.S., in a $400 million military aid package to Ukraine announced in November, provided funds for the Czech Republic to refurbish 45 T-72 Soviet-era tanks for delivery to Ukraine. And Poland has reportedly already supplied Ukraine with more than 200 Soviet-era tanks. The Biden administration last week announced $3.75 billion in new military assistance to Kyiv, and that included 50 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles and 36 additional howitzers, among other munitions and armaments. Likewise, Germany committed to sending around 40 Marder infantry fighting vehicles. But the Biden administration still appears to see Abrams as a step too far, for now. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre did not address a direct question Wednesday on whether President Biden is considering sending Abrams tanks to Ukraine. He said there were several factors for the U.S. that could sway officials in the direction of providing the tanks, including public pressure, losses in Ukraine and other NATO allies providing similar equipment. President Vladimir Putin's move to replace his top commander in Ukraine is a sign of military disarray and his growing impatience in a war Russia is not winning, analysts said. The Defense Ministry in Moscow said Wednesday it had, again, replaced its top commander in Ukraine, putting Army Chief of Staff Valery Gerasimov in charge. Russian and Western observers said the move was a sign of Putin becoming exasperated by Ukrainian resistance, but also by fault lines in the Russian army command as it faces difficult demands which could include launching a possible major offensive within weeks. Analysts said putting an army chief of staff in charge of an operation on the ground is highly unusual, as the job is usually removed from the battlefield, involving coordination, political contacts, threat evaluation and logistics choices. That Putin made the appointment anyway shows that things are not going to plan, said a Moscow-based defense analyst, speaking to AFP on condition of anonymity. The short legacy of Surovikin, famous for his shaved head and uncompromising scowl, and appointed only in October, was marked by missile attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure, an apparent attempt to cow civilians into submission. But that strategy has not shown signs of working, adding to Russia's frustrations over its failure, nearly 11 months into the war, to beat Ukraine's army, undermine its government, or warn off Western countries increasingly willing to send sophisticated weapons to Kyiv. Troop morale took a major hit when Russia suffered its worst military losses from a single Ukrainian attack, with the death of at least 89 servicemen in Makiivka in eastern Ukraine over New Year. Russia currently does not control the full extent of the Ukrainian regions of Lugansk and Donetsk, while Russian forces pulled out of Kherson city in November. Russia has meanwhile never occupied Zaporizhzhia city. Russia is avoiding flying its advanced combat jets over Ukraine for fear of the wreckage from a crash, giving away the plane's secrets, an expert told Insider. The Sukhoi Su-57, a modern Russian aircraft prized for its stealth, has not been a regular feature of the war so far, despite Moscow's efforts to hype its capabilities. Per the British update, Russia sends the jets up and has them fire long-range missiles at targets in Ukraine. But it won't risk sending them over the border, where Ukrainian air defenses could knock them out. Bronk told Insider that Russia is scared of the consequences if a Su-57 was shot down, and Ukraine's allies in NATO could study the wreckage. The UK update said Russia was holding back with Su-57s because it was avoiding the reputational damage, reduced export prospects, and the compromise of sensitive technology which would come from any loss of the craft. Russia's tactic of using the jets from its own territory is indicative of its continued risk-averse approach to employing its air force in the war against Ukraine. Oleksiy Danilov, Secretary of the Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, is convinced that there will be a power struggle between the armed forces, the military formations of Yevgeny Prigozhin and Ramzan Kadyrov, as well as the new armed formation of the Russian security forces, and their confrontation will reach the center of Moscow. Danilov deemed the fact that Sergei Surovikin was pushed into office by Valery Gerasimov, who is called the architect of special military operation, a manifestation of the power struggle. The internal disputes that are currently going on in Russia will only escalate, the National Security and Defense Council, RNBO, secretary believes. According to Danilov, it is only a matter of time before a confrontation with the use of firearms, armored personnel carriers, etc. begins among the Garden Ring, a circular ring road avenue around central Moscow. Today, there are already 3.5 armies, separately, Kadyrov's army, separately, Prigozhin's army, separately, the army that is in the armed forces of the Russian Federation, where neither Kadyrov nor Prigozhin are respected, and separately, the law enforcement agencies that are now trying to form a separate army. According to Danilov, a war of private companies in the Russian Federation will be for sure, because a war for power will begin in Russia. He noted that Vladimir Putin is also a very ill person. As soon as he weakens, and he will weaken every day, the showdown will begin, the NSDC secretary said. Ukrainian military spokesperson Serhiy Cherevatiy reported that the salt mining town of Soldar in the eastern Donetsk Oblast, the site of the fiercest fighting, came under Russian attacks 91 times over the past day. Russian forces have claimed that they control Soldar, but Ukraine denies it, saying that the fighting continues. Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar said Russia continues its offensive in the Soldar area, trying to break through the Ukrainian defenses and capture the city. Earlier in the day, President Volodymyr Zelensky pledged that the units defending Bakhmut and Soldar would be provided with ammunition and everything necessary, promptly and uninterruptedly. Also, on January 12, Ukraine's Special Operations Forces reported that over 100 Russian soldiers had been killed in the Battle of Soldar after Ukrainian forces launched a missile strike. On the previous day, Zelensky said Soldar is almost completely destroyed, but the fighting continues, and the eastern front line is holding. The comment came after Russia claimed to take control over the city and later denied it. Russia is building up its forces in Ukraine, but Ukrainian forces are holding out in fierce fighting for the eastern town of Soldar, Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar said on Thursday. She told a news briefing that the number of Russian military units in Ukraine had risen to 280 from 250 a week earlier as Moscow tried to gain that strategic initiative. Fighting is fierce in the Soldar direction, Maliar said. They, the Russians, are moving over their own corpses. Russia is driving its own people to the slaughter by the thousands, but we are holding on, she said. Another senior military official, Brigadier General Alexei Gromov, told the briefing that the military situation in Ukraine remained difficult, with the heaviest fighting on the Eastern Front. Russian forces were trying to cut through Ukrainian lines and surround Ukrainian troops, he said. Gromov also said the danger of an attack being launched from Belarus, a Russian ally to the north of Ukraine, would remain throughout this year. A delegation headed by the commander of Russia's ground forces, Oleg Salyakov, visited Belarus on Thursday to inspect the combat readiness of a joint force stationed there, the Belarusian Defense Ministry said. Russia and its close ally Belarus have beefed up their joint military grouping in Belarus and plan to hold joint aviation drills there from next Monday. The exercises form part of a pattern of activity that has prompted Ukraine to warn that Russian President Vladimir Putin may try to use Belarus to launch a new ground invasion of Ukraine from the north. Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko allowed Putin to use his country as one of the launchpads to invade Ukraine last February, when Russian forces were beaten back in an attempt to take the capital Kyiv. Military analysts say Russia has also used Belarusian facilities to train up newly mobilized soldiers who were called up last September to boost its forces in Ukraine.